Alright. What's up, everybody, and welcome back. Well, the Cyclone's been massively changed in the most recent patch that's being tested, and we are already seeing multiple instances of it absolutely dominating and destroying its opponents. It's being massed. It's not a few Cyclones. We're seeing mass Cyclones running around the map and destroying people. The weird thing is, I've had people coming to me and saying, it's super overpowered, and I see some games where it wrecks, and I go, oh, maybe it is. But then I've got just as many people coming to me, appearing in my Twitch chat, my comment section, saying, the new Cyclone sucks, it's really bad, and we need to put it back as it is, because it's useless right now. So, I, of course, was like, all right, well, I'm not just going to take everyone's word for it. I went in, I played a bunch of games with the Cyclone, and I kind of had the same result. Some games, I freaking destroyed people, and it felt super broken, and other games, it felt like it really wasn't very good at all. So I've been tearing my hair out trying to figure out how to make this video about the Cyclone, because at first it was the Cyclone's kind of bad, and I started making a video about that, and I was halfway through recording it, and then I watched some more games, and I was like, actually, it looks really good, and I'm seesawing back and forth, and at this point, I'm pretty convinced it is imba in some scenarios, and kind of underpowered in others. But there's a lot of details to why, and different factors muddying the water. So what I'm going to do is I've watched like hundreds of games of pro matches with the new Cyclone, and I'm going to try and distill all the information that I've absorbed and explain to you why the Cyclone's way too powerful in some scenarios and why it's probably a bit too weak in other scenarios. So I'm going to take you down my kind of realization process, studying this, trying to figure this whole thing out with the new Cyclone. So what we're going to cover today is how this makes Mech vs Protoss viable, though there's a big question mark there. It is a bit of a maybe. How it's completely broken versus Zerg, at least in people's first impressions. The power of the new Cyclone's micro ability, just how easy and smooth it is to micro, and how it scales really well if you're an insanely good player like Clem. Its mass ability, the fact that you can react to them out and just pump them like crazy. We're going to then compare it to the 2018 reacted Cyclone, which could also get pumped out, and why it's so different to that Cyclone. Then we're going to just talk about and wrap up with the drastic differences between pre-speed and post-speed upgrade on this Cyclone, and how there's such a ridiculous power spike after that upgrade kicks in. And last of all, we'll talk about the reasons why it might not actually be overpowered at all, and my whole thesis here that it is super overpowered in some scenarios. There are a few developments that might happen. I don't think there's a good chance of it. They might happen, and they might prove me entirely wrong. Okay, so first up, we want to talk about, is Mech now viable? Okay, so first up, we want to talk about, is Mech now viable against Protoss? Clem, on one of the first days, 3-hour stream here versus Skillis, playing Mech every game with mass Cyclone openings. And it was really cool to see. Like, this game here, first game, looks so promising. He's up on 3 bases, going to 4 bases. He's got a pack of Cyclones, some tanks, and Widow Mines. And then he gets Storm dropped. And you're like, okay, fair enough, took a bit of damage, not too bad. If we fast forward just a few seconds, Prism's in the main, there's Zealots there. He pulls his mobile units to respond. Skillis dives in, takes the tanks out at the front. His Cyclones are isolated on the left. He's losing all of his SCVs on his third. And it's kind of just that classic Mech situation where it looks all good, you feel like you're in a good spot, and then everything just crumbles. There's always some Zealots find their way into your backline, you get caught out of position, and everything falls apart. But Clem wasn't going to be stopped there. He kept trying to make it work over and over again, and he was playing this. Look at this game. This game was going way better. 13 minutes in, he's going to his 6th base here, and he's trying to defend here, and he's just barely hanging on. And in comes the mothership as well, but it looks like he might just barely have the numbers to win, even with the time up there, but there's more Zealots coming in from behind, as well as Stalkers. He's trying to get back. The SCVs are there, and it feels like, okay, he's just barely surviving, maybe, just maybe. And unfortunately, just when you think he's maybe stabilized, another 10 Zealots come in, and carriers float in from the left, and he basically just gets overrun here. He loses that command center, and he just can't get his supply back up, and he gets overwhelmed. Next game, Clem queues up again. Once again, Skillis doing a bit of a random attack here, and Clem's like, let's go, man. And actually, it looks like a really bad attack for Skillis. He's losing all of his Stalkers and the Immortal, even though it does well versus these units. It just gets, annihilated because there's too many Cyclones. But then in comes the 8-gate Zealot Warpins, and once again, the Cyclones just don't quite have the numbers, and it's a slippery slope. I'll fast forward a little bit to show you guys, but basically he's just there, he's always got 2 or 3 Cyclones, and they're trying to run back, but the moment you've got SCVs fighting Zealots, you know you're pretty screwed. You can, fast forward through here, the Zealots are on his 3rd, he's running away, Clem dies again. It was just this, for 3 hours, basically his stream was him looking like he was getting to a good position, and then just barely getting overwhelmed. So after losing games repeatedly, Clem swapped it up. He went Bio for a few games, won a few games in a row. He even did a cool double Cyclone drop into Bio one game. And then in the final game of the 3-hour stream, here he wins his first Mech game with the Cyclones. And it looked pretty decent. But overall, it was a really unsuccessful stream. And this is why a lot of Terran players, I think, were messaging me and even linking me this stream and saying, did you see Clem try to make Cyclones work for 3 hours and get absolutely hammered? Next up, we look at Harstem, who posted a video practicing games with Spirit. And this series looked silly. Like, basically, Spirit just got 4 bases up pretty early every game and then just ran Cyclones in from all sides, eventually adding Ghosts and Tanks. And man, when those Stalkers got EMP'd, they were going down so quick to the Cyclones and the Tanks, and it felt like Harstem just couldn't keep up. He eventually won a very close game 3, but it was insane just how well the Mass Cyclone was securing such large economies in these games, and especially when they added those extra units like Ghosts and Tanks. It kind of reminded me here of the Cyclone was kind of being used like a Marine Marauder combo, where you just make them and you support them with like a few tanks and a few ghosts, or a few mines and a few ghosts. And it was weird, their ability to just like dive in, and even when it's like, oh, your army might not be stronger with them, but they're so fast, they would like just dart in and catch him out of position. Like, he has such trouble defending up here. We can fast forward this game a few seconds, and he's like finally cleaning up the army there. And he's like, okay, I lost my base, but I got rid of this. And of course, by the time you deal with it, it's very similar to playing against Bio, where you barely hold a push on one side, but you really had to scramble to do it. And then there's another army stimming on the other side, and you're just knocked out of the game. You can see the frustration on Harstem's face. I know I'm kind of hiding him behind me. You guys can see little bits of Harstem's very frustrated face there poking out. You can just see him kind of like, oh my God, getting circles run around me. So I actually had a chat to Harstem about these games because, I mean, it kind of looked like Mech looked trash in that first one with Clem, but then Spirit started to make it look way better here. And I asked Harstem, and I said, you know, are the Cyclones too good? Are they too weak? What do you think? And he said, look, I think TOS just should not build melee units versus them. I thought I could surround, but you just get kited to death automatically. So you need to rely on pure Stalker, and then Cyclones scale very poorly. It's just that getting Zealots is pointless, and I kept making Zealots. He also said blinking forward also is really bad. So everything that used to be good versus this type of composition now is awful. So the way you view fights just completely changes. All right, so now we're going to be taking a look at Clem vs. the Laser from the Wardy Balance tournament, which is such a nice tournament for showing us, hey, what the hell is going on? It's still early understanding, but getting pros playing for an important amount of money teaches us a lot. Now, essentially, the old Cyclone came out very slowly, one at a time, right? The previous Cyclone. It came out from a tech lab factory as well. So you could just defend this by buying time with a wall of queens, a few Zerglings if they try to run in. And eventually, once you get 3 bases, you could go mass roaches and defend that way. But you're going to notice this Cyclone, there's already 7 Cyclones on the front with speed at 6 minutes. Yeah, Clem delayed his 3rd command center to get this, but this is silly. Notice the queens are getting almost no damage. The Cyclones might not have crazy range, but they are basically able to kill queens for free. And as long as you have a few Hellions backing them up, Zerglings can't do anything about this outside of maybe overcommitting to Zerglings and getting 1 giant surround. But if you have to overcommit to army for 1 giant surround, usually that's not a very consistent way of defending here. Now, against the old Cyclones, if someone like straight rushed into this sort of like 3 factory, they really committed to get this sort of pressure going, you would rush Lair, Roach Speed, and basically tech on up from there, right? You would go up into a quick Roach Speed, stay on a similar, maybe you'd even get lower on workers than the Terran, but once you crush the Cyclones with a big flank of Roaches, you're way ahead, right? And so it was actually a decent kind of balancing act in that scenario. The problem right now is these Cyclones pump 2 at a time out of a factory with a reactor. You don't need to invest that much to get them out, and they are just out of control. We could see Clem literally just won the game with a Cyclone Hellion pressure here in Game 1 versus the Laser. We saw a bit of a greedier opening in Game 2 here between Clem and a Laser, but it was still crazy because he was able to just make like 80, 90 workers, as many commands as he want. And he also was taking map control at the same time, despite a Laser changing it up, rushing Hydralisks out this time to have a unit that had equal range and could kind of skirmish with the Cyclones. The crazy thing is, even though Clem played a 3cc opening, he still forced a Laser to play less economically, and it felt like a Laser was struggling to get out from under the pressure of the Cyclone, even though he did this different response. I feel like it was fine before with the previous Cyclone, because if you wanted to put on this sort of pressure, force this response, 3 factories, mag field, super delayed 3rd command center. Instead, Clem is getting that same response while going for a quick 3rd command center. That is why we are seeing this look super powerful in this matchup. Clem said, when I asked him, he said, I think they might be too weak versus Protoss, but definitely, he said, they might be too weak versus Protoss and too good versus Zerg, how they are right now. I asked Spirit. Spirit said they're probably too strong versus Zerg, too weak versus Protoss, But just keep in mind, Pig, Clem owning everyone with them isn't a great indicator. So Spirit kind of gave us the addendum of like, they look really good. Remember, this is Clem. And that's a really good point we'll bring back later, because remember, these units are super microable, and Clem's multitasking and micro is such a big boon when it comes to using these Cyclones. Funnily enough, so that I don't just present quotes that back up my whole opinion here, Hero Marine, he just said, generally, I don't think the Cyclone's that good. It's fun to use. I think generally, I don't think it's that good yet. And I have said to him, well, actually, a lot of the other players are saying it looks way too good versus Zerg. You know, he hasn't responded just yet, but I'll try to follow up in the comments if he ends up responding to that, agreeing or disagreeing. All right, so I just wanted to show you guys the end of this game because I thought it was really interesting. We had tanks, Cyclones, Hellions all here on the bottom, big push, and a laser just gets lurkers out. So they're going to stop the push in the bottom. Clem can't push through that, and he says, cool, you can't push. I'm going to base trade. Runs across the map and catches Clem way out of position. Clem does siege a few tanks and Widow Mines, but with the Blinding Clouds, this should be a great hold. But look at the minimap. I'm going to rewind a few seconds, and I want you to look at the minimap and look how quick that blue mass comes up and gets back in position. The moment he realizes the laser's running through the middle, and yes, Sensor Towers help because they give him warning, look at how quickly the Cyclones get back to defend. The Cyclone movement speed is absolutely cracked, and I thought this was a great example, so I wanted to show this right here, because what looks like it will be okay for a laser, he can't even get on the tanks. The Cyclone Hellion, it's already back there, and this just turns into a game-winning fight for Clem. That brings us to the micro ability of the Cyclone. It is so important we talk about this because this is one of the first videos that started popping off on YouTube where Hero Marine went through and showed the Cyclone in a lot of different situations. And this was kind of his first impressions, just testing, seeing how it went. And he saw that it gets absolutely destroyed by Zerglings, even with him microing his heart out. And he's like, wow, I thought it would do better than that. I mean, yes, he did 60 supply of Zerglings, only 40 supply of Cyclones, but you know, it got surrounded and basically said, okay, I guess it's really, really bad versus Zerglings. Problem. This was a completely crappy test. I on stream decided to test it myself just to get a feel for it, and I ended up testing it with the exact same number of units, and notice how my Cyclones aren't stuttering the way his were. He was trying to get them to lock on constantly, but notice that I focus on never letting my Cyclones stop moving, and you can see that if you time it perfectly, Cyclones can fight almost like a phoenix, where they just move and shoot almost flawlessly. And it is actually incredibly smooth the way the Cyclone locks on, where that turret spins so quickly. If you give it an attack move, it locks on and you can keep moving. And this is when it started to dawn on me just how microable this unit is. It's very, very smooth and responsive. That's a key point, because remember, Harston pointed out that Zealots just were the big reason he was getting his butt kicked against Spirit. He kept making Zealots out of habit because Zealots used to be good versus the old Cyclone. They aren't good versus the new Cyclone because there's more of them and they're not as reliant on some bonus anti-armored damage like the old Cyclone was. And they're so massable. They're very, in the old days, it was like you'd always have way more units than they have Cyclones. Having some Zealots soak up the shots was good. Now there's just as many Cyclones as there are Protoss units, and they can just run away so smoothly and kite your Zealots to death. You also have to factor in the mass ability, the ability and accessibility of this unit. Remember, you get 2 factories with reactors on them. You cannot make the speed upgrade. That is the one thing kind of gating them. But just in terms of raw production, 2 factories on reactors, you can make 8 Cyclones every 64 seconds. That's 16 Cyclones in just over 2 minutes out of just 2 factories. So you can mass this unit like crazy. All right, so I went digging because I was like thinking about this and I was like, how powerful is that accessibility of the unit? Because it kind of makes your units almost like Zerg units. You can just pump them out. It's quantity over quality. So I went back to 2018, the last time Cyclones could be pumped out of reactors. And you'll notice these Cyclones are way slower than the new speed upgraded Cyclones. And they also sucked at moving and shooting. This old Cyclone had crazy stats, but it was quite expensive. So it was about double the cost of the current Cyclone. It was very expensive. It had 180 hit points. It was way tankier. So it was very tanky, very massable, very expensive, but it sucked at microing. Because it only did, it shot insanely fast, but if you shoot it, pull back, shoot it, pull back, shoot it, pull back, it would only get like a tiny bit of micro damage off each time. So it would get ruined by like Stalkers or any units that outrange it far enough, because they're kind of slow and awkward moving forwards and they clump up a bit, they could get ravaged by like tanks and marauders and stuff like that. So overall, the Cyclone was very powerful for some early game timings, but it was owned by enemy micro. And that's something where the modern Cyclone is way faster, way more microable. It does still have some issues if it's like outranged and out-microed by the enemy, but nowhere near as bad as this old Cyclone. This old Cyclone fell off hard, and that was kind of necessary because otherwise you could just mass them and overwhelm. All right, so here's a great example from the balance tournament of Harston versus Clem, where that looks like a decent-ish fight, but then you realize there's actually just more Stalkers than there are Cyclones, and when they're outnumbered and they don't have tanks or EMP behind them, notice how the Stalkers don't die. Harston's losing no Stalkers here. He's just blinking back, blinking back, blinking back. So the Cyclones can get killed in that scenario. But keep in mind, that's a numbers issue. In the old days with that old Cyclone I was talking about, similar or even lesser numbers of Stalkers could just micro them down super efficiently. You can't do that against this Cyclone. You need to have a numbers advantage. So far, the main way we see this Cyclone look terrible is when it's drastically outnumbered. It's when there are some scenarios, if you have like lurkers or enough siege tanks or something, obviously it can get shot down from far away, or enough immortals. But for the most part, before those stages, it's only if you're low on production. And that makes sense, right? You're massing a low tier unit. It's not meant to be a super strong unit that has a great defender's advantage. You are just meant to have a mass of them. It's like, you know, it's kind of like thinking of like a roach defense. You can't just defend with 5 roaches versus 10 stalkers. You'll get ravaged. It's all about numbers when it comes to using the Cyclone. So right now, not only is the Cyclone very powerful because it can just swarm on top of you with large numbers, but even when you get caught out, check this out. Harston caught Clem's Cyclones with a big stasis trap, came forward with sentries to force field them. And this is actually just comical. I wanted to include this because this is ridiculous. The Cyclones, only one Cyclone died. Harston obviously should have lifted them up and stuff. He did kind of screw the pooch. And this is accentuated because notice this is a boosty zone around this watchtower, or around this cliff, this little pillar here, which makes it even faster of a getaway. Speed Cyclones plus boosty zone is comically stupid, but let's be real. Harston didn't have that many units, and he should have used his Phoenix to pick up 4 of those Cyclones. So this was a mistake from Harston and a good distraction by the other Cyclones from Clem. Nonetheless, pretty hilarious to watch though, just how fast the freaking Cyclone is, man. A lot of players that were saying the Cyclone looked really Ember, I think we're talking about this game as well. So this is a really silly engagement. Once again, keep in mind there's 2 speedy zones in this fight. And that is why the Cyclones are able to move on top so quickly. So they already are a bit fast and crazy when they outnumber the enemy. It's kind of like swarming someone with Mass Zealot or Zergling or something. If you've just got a bigger, better army than theirs, it kind of looks silly because they're so fast they get on top. Keep in mind though, look at this. Half of Harston's army wasn't here. It comes in from the bottom of the screen after the fight. He'd already spent his disruptor shot, and Harston wasn't maxed. It just made no sense for Harston to be on the map at that point. Let's go back a few seconds and look at his army. It's 2 Immortals, a Colossus, a handful of Stalkers, and 1 Disruptor. So as silly as this looked, it's accentuated by number 1, a map feature. Number 2, Harston made a massive mistake by being here with only half of his army. Clem had been harassing him with Cyclones on both sides of the map, and that's why Harston had half of his army in the bottom. He just didn't have enough map vision, and he moved out on the map a bit dangerously, and he got caught here. I think Harston will be the first person to tell you this is not a good example of the Cyclone being overpowered. Whereas the games in the Terran vs. Zerg, it felt a lot more oppressive. You couldn't identify the mistakes from the Zerg players as easily. All right, so that last point naturally flows into this one. We want to talk about the drastic difference between pre-speed and post-speed upgrade Cyclones. And a lot of the players have been saying, look, it feels like it's a bit too crazy how much slower and weaker it is before the upgrade finishes as opposed to after. If speed was finished here, this would be a massive victory in some of these fights for Clem. Instead, he's not killing a single Stalker. They're all blinking away, and he's losing all of his Cyclones. Now, Skillus overcommits and loses like 4 Stalkers he didn't need to. But despite that, he'd already killed like 6 Cyclones for 0. So it still ended up being a massively positive trade, and this set him up to win this game a little bit later, just because the speed wasn't on time. And it's kind of interesting how there is this crazy power spike where it does feel maybe like it's too much of a power spike. On the other hand, I mean, the Cyclone's still pretty decent defensively. It's just not going to defend you from everything on of its own. And it's okay for there to be weak points. Think about Bio, Pre-Stim, and Shields and how different Marines and Marauders are once those upgrades kick in, right? I think this is okay, but definitely something to keep an eye on. It feels too drastic right now. Maybe it's something we'll just figure out. All right, so we've talked a lot about how there is definitely promise for mech PvT, though a lot of the games we've seen it not quite working just yet. There's times where it's working, there's times where it's getting absolutely crushed, and it still seems a little bit up in the air with most pro players landing on the side of it's not that good. The Protoss players that are dying to it, like Harston in this series where he lost 2 games, won 1 game versus Spirit, he's like, you know, I just think I was on autopilot, and there's a lot of reprogramming in my brain. There's a lot of the pro players saying, look, it's so different. You actually have to do the opposite of what you used to have to do against these units, and we need to reprogram, and we're messing up in these games. We actually don't think it's that powerful, and you might actually need to overinvest in the Cyclone, you know, getting the upgrade out and being so committed to Mass Cyclone, which should make it, in theory, easier for the Protoss players to handle it. On the other hand, it does look, from the limited sample size we have, that it looks too good versus Zerg, as well as with a lot of the players, you know, Clem and Spirit especially, saying it does look too good versus Zerg. And I really feel the reason is, as we said, because those queens just can't deal with it. So what about, what if I'm wrong? What are the reasons that I might be wrong? Let's talk about them a little bit. All right, so the reasons why I could be wrong about them being too powerful versus Zerg is maybe Zergs can do full Ling surrounds and actually consistently threaten that. Because notice there's very few Hellions in these Cyclone armies. They're reliant on just a few Hellions in the back and a big clump of Cyclones. And if you could overproduce Zerglings, get one big surround, remember surrounding was always the danger on the previous Cyclone as well, because it is still a kiting unit, that locks on, pulls back, locks on, pulls back. If you can get a big wraparound, even this Ling backstab looking promising here for a laser, you might be able to shut it down. I also think a laser and a few of the other Zergs are still not used to building Infestors into their build, and perhaps squeezing a few Infestors out earlier in the mid-game, now that they don't need pathogen glands, could be really important for shutting down the mobility of these sorts of styles. And that's why I think going Roach into Infestor is actually probably going to be a bit more popular against this style than going straight Hydras. Even though Hydras have a bit more range than Roaches, the Roaches are so much cheaper, more accessible, and you can always get more of them out and then flank the Cyclones and sandwich them, put them in a position where they don't have anywhere to run. That is, though, probably going to be requiring a faster lair for Roach speed and a faster lair to try to get towards those Infestors. So that's going to be a big meta shift, which should probably take a while to develop. I don't think that's going to happen overnight. Players also might realize they don't really need an economy advantage like they normally do against normal mech. If we take a look in game 1, you can see that a laser was really pushing his economy, taking a super late lair on Roach Horn. Maybe Zergs will start saying, you know what, you're building an inefficient army and just trying to get map control and be greedy behind it. If I cut my workers and then I just crush your army one time, I can just counterattack and win the game. This army right now is really banking on basically exerting map presence and being quite greedy behind it and putting you on the back foot. I don't think you need necessarily to have more workers. I think you need more workers versus tanks and Thors and technical mech units that are efficient. These aren't efficient. If you get the correct fight against Cyclones, they crumble. If you flank them, surround them, or just catch them with the right numbers in the right position, they fall apart. So I think there needs to be a mindset shift in Zergs and Protoss players playing against this sort of mass Cyclone style from I need more economy because I'm going to be less efficient to I don't need as much economy, I just need to take the correct engagement. And that is what will defeat this style. Last but not least, for the players who are thinking it's too powerful against Protoss, I do think if the Protoss players start, and like I said, a week ago I was thinking this is OP versus Protoss, or even 2 days ago I was like, this is overpowered versus Protoss, they're just spamming Cyclones, this looks so silly looking at these games. But after speaking to the pros, if they can do what Harstam said, stop mindlessly making Zealots because they don't do well, those Cyclones are too microable, and just kite them away, and if also they can not blink Stalkers on them. He said, you know, normally you used to blink on the Cyclones to kill them quickly, but that doesn't actually work, that helps the Cyclones. You should only be blinking the Stalkers away and never letting them actually kill the Stalkers, and then you'll trade really well. Once Protoss players reprogram that, I think we're very likely to see the view of this mass Cyclones Imba versus Protoss to fade away very quickly. I'd like to finish up with a quote from Harstam's YouTube comments here, which really sums up the entire change here in the paradigm with this new Cyclone right now. This is from LQ32332 on Harstam's YouTube video. He said it's interesting, or they said it's interesting how the Cyclone changes the mech army from an efficient one into an inefficient one, but with way more map control. It kind of makes it Zerg-like, letting the mech player expand much easier. It's weird, because I'd initially envisioned the Cyclone as this kind of quick reaction force. You'd get a few Cyclones, there's mobile anti-air and general purpose units, kind of like a mech stalker, where if you get attacked on one flank, you can quickly move them there, whereas all your other siege and very slow units can't respond very quickly. They can move into your main and defender prism. The weird thing is that if you play like that, you lose the huge mobility advantages of roaming the map with the mass speed Cyclone, and it seems like the players are either like, okay, we're just going to play standard and not use Cyclones, or if we're going to use Cyclones, we're going to lean into that map control advantage, use that giant speed advantage, that crazy smooth micro ability where they can lock on instantly, and once they finish a lock on, there's no cooldown, they just lock onto a new target. This style does look a bit crazy, a bit spammy, and a little bit silly to me right now, but as players learn to deal with it, maybe it'll actually be a rather fun dynamic. There's always that part of your brain that gets revolted when you see 30 Cyclones jump on an army and just kill it, and you're like, that looks stupid. But as players learn to counter it, it might actually create some rather enjoyable environments, and I'm completely undecided on this. Right now, it looks a bit broken against Zerg, but I'm curious to hear what you all think about it. For me, I'm going to be watching closely the next week or two. I'm going to also be seeing, will Clem use it at all in the finals tomorrow against Solar in the Balance Cup? That's when I'm recording this, the day before that. So I'm really excited to see what happens. It feels like so much is up in the air with this Cyclone, and a lot of people are very unsure of how to balance it between verse Zerg and verse Protoss power. Let me know what you think in the comments. Is it broken? How would you change it or tweak it yourself? And thank you very much for watching and putting up with this convoluted video that I've been tearing my hairs out trying to watch so many games, trying to absorb and understand this unit. I hope you understood something more from this. Please ask questions. I'll try to clarify in the comments, and we'll do a follow-up if it warrants it and my viewpoints change. Thank you for watching. We'll see you next time. Goodbye and good night.